I think the idea started when I first got to WVU in 2007. And I was just telling somebody here that I think the real impetus for the book kind of kicked off when Rebecca Durst was chosen to be the second female Mountaineer in 2009. I'd been here for a couple of years at that point. And I was really surprised at the sort of backlash about her being selected, that so many people were unhappy that a woman would be the Mountaineer, because I knew that there had already been one. And that really was what tipped me off that there's more to this figure of the Mountaineer than meets the eye, right? That people are really invested in this, and people have really strong ideas about who can be the Mountaineer, what it means to be a Mountaineer. And I think it really sort of started then. So in that way, that's 10 years. But in terms of the actual writing, the really intensive writing, 5 or 6 years, I would say. No, this is my first book. I've written a number of articles, but this is my first book. I mean, in part, it's that in my department, we have to have a book to get promoted to full professor. But also, I have always wanted to write a book, so I'm really excited that I was finally able to do it. That's a tough one. I mean, what the book talks about is that, a Mountaineer is both a synonym for somebody from West Virginia in general. It's also more specifically, very specifically, this guy, but also refers to WVU students. So what the book explores is that that's what's interesting about the concept of and the definition of a Mountaineer, is that there is no one way to define the Mountaineer. It depends on who you're talking to and what context you're in. But I think in general, the idea of the Mountaineer is that they share certain traits, right? I think we recognize the Mountaineer as somebody who is, stalwart and, independent thinking, kind of a rabble-rouser, but also somebody who is hospitable and personable. Those, I think, are the kind of core elements that have stayed the same over time.
The Mountaineer is definitely somebody who is very personable. It's kind of, I think that gives us the advantage over other mascots, is that we're somebody that the people can get to know. Like I said, we're very personable, relatable, and kind of a representative for Mountaineers everywhere.
Because I think when people sort of hear the word folklore, they think that somebody's a folklorist, they sort of immediately think of folk tales, fairy tales, urban legends, that kind of stuff. And folklorists are definitely interested in all of those things. But really what folklorists are interested in more broadly is kind of the expressive nature of daily life. So all the things that we do in groups and kind of on an informal basis to bring meaning to our lives. And certainly the way we do our research is through talking to people, right? Collecting people's stories. So that's really that's really where I came into this project, was as somebody who I want to hear these stories. I want to hear former Mountaineers' stories about what it was like for them to be the Mountaineer. I want to talk to alumni and faculty and current students about what it means to be a Mountaineer, because it's only when I hear all those stories that I can kind of create a bigger picture about what this figure has meant to people and the many different ways in which it has had that meaning. And a lot of the book really talks about how the term Mountaineer really, it's been around for a couple of hundred years as a synonym for somebody from West Virginia. But it's gotten, it has its roots in kind of the two different figures, right? On the one side, you've kind of got the backwoodsman or the frontiersman, and then on the other side, you've sort of got this, hillbilly figure. And I think for a lot of, the 20th century for sure, calling yourself a Mountaineer was a way of kind of talking back to that hillbilly identity and saying, we can take the parts of what that means, being free thinking, not being, not being tied to kind of conventional mainstream things. You know, we can take the good parts of that notion of what it means to be a hillbilly, but turn it into something more noble, and something more that can't be used against us.
WVU has done a very good job of kind of recreating that, you know, especially with the whole Go First campaign, the rebranding and all that stuff. So, you know, I think the term Mountaineer is definitely going in a better direction than what it used to be.
Interesting. Sure. I consider myself a mountaineer, not the Mountaineer. It's different, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, both in the sense that, you know, I am a resident of the state, I work for the university, but also because I really can resonate with a lot of those traits of the Mountaineer that I talked about, you know, that sort of independent thinking and, you know, resilience and, you know, kind of a little bit of an upstart attitude, maybe.
You know, going right off what Rosemary said, you know, the Mountaineers, free thinking, maybe a little bit of a rebel. You know, I mean, I think that I feel like I definitely have that those attributes, and I think that it helps me be the Mountaineer better. Again, it gives me that advantage, I guess. But you know, anybody can be a Mountaineer. You know, I go to alumni events all over the country, and people say, you know, we're Mountaineers, and that's one thing that I kind of stress whenever I'm talking to people is that's the beauty of WVU is you'll find Mountaineers literally everywhere, and that's something special that we have. Yeah. My brother, who lives in Columbus, Ohio, says that every time he wears his, you know, baseball cap with the flying WV on it, anywhere he goes, people just come, you know, like will make a beeline if they see it and say, are you from, you know, did you go to WVU, or are you from West Virginia? You know, I think people have that experience all over the world, really. So, and that's something that's really, I mean, I think a similar thing might happen if you were to wear other college regalia, maybe, but I'm not sure that people would have the same kind of sense that, you know, we're kindred spirits, right? You know, they might know that we have something in common, but not that sense that we, you know, kind of. Right. Yeah, almost like a lifelong family kind of feeling.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I guess I hope that when people read it, they'll find out things they'll read about some things that they knew about the history of the Mountaineer, but I hope that they'll also you know, discover things that they didn't know about, right? The depth of that history. I mean, I know that for me, that was the fun part about researching it and writing it, was kind of digging into the, you know, the interviews and talking to people and looking around in the archives and finding the backstory about a lot of these events and a lot of these people. And so I hope that when people read it, they'll, you know, every few pages they'll be like, oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. I think we've seen that a lot with J.D. Vance, the success of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, and, you know, all the focus that has been on the region since, you know, the 2016 election. And I think a lot, you know, it was just, I think a lot of national news outlets came into the state and, you know, deliberately sought out exactly the person they were looking for, right? You know, the sort of backwards hillbilly type that they could sort of blame everything on. And I think, I'm not sure that we're ever going to not face that in some ways. I mean, I would like to say that we would, but I think old attitudes like that die hard and old images like that die hard. But I do think I've been really encouraged by what I've seen happening in the last few years in West Virginia, of people kind of, you know, and young people especially, really talking back to those attitudes and saying, you know, no, we're, you know, this is not a dying place. This is not, you know, this is not a backwards place. You know, there are a lot of young people here who are really concerned about the future of this place and, you know, where it's going and how, you know, how to make it a better place for everybody to live. And so, you know, in that sense, I think what's been interesting about this incarnation of those hillbilly ideas is I sort of feel like there's been a much more grassroots kind of response to that, of people saying, oh no, no, we're not having that, and really talking back to it.
Being the Mountaineer, I don't think people, you know, going back to what Rosemary said, you know, the term Mountaineer can people either identify with like this, I guess, like the pioneer, frontiersman, or the hillbilly. So I think the fact that people see me as, I guess, frontiersman. I've actually been called frontiersman many times.
That's interesting.
I get called pioneer all the time.
Pioneer. Wow.
I mean, and there's always, unfortunately, for many years, has been that stereotype that, West Virginia's full of hillbillies. But that's not the case. I think it's really important that we make that known throughout the country and throughout the world.
For me, it was a success the day I sent the files off to the press and was done with it. At that point, I was sort of like, oh, yay, this is out of my hands now. So, I guess if it does in fact sort of start a conversation about what we mean by the idea of the Mountaineer and what Mountaineer identity is, then I will definitely consider it a success. It certainly doesn't have, for me, anything to do with the number of copies that get sold. I just hope that, people will find it interesting enough. I will say that Marianne Salmon, who did the emceeing, texted me this picture last night that she was behind this truck driving home from work that had a sticker on it that said, "Built by a hillbilly." And she was like, "Look what I just saw," right? And I texted her back and said, now my evil plan is complete because you're seeing it everywhere. And so I guess that's sort of the measure of success for me, is if it gets other people thinking about, oh yeah, there's another example of that and another, and makes them think. That's success to me. Like I said, it was the pushback against Rebecca Durst that really kind of triggered my interest in wondering what the Mountaineer what it was about the Mountaineer that made people so kind of protective of it in that way. But I do think, I think there are lots of, one thing that's also really interesting in the examples of both Natalie Tennant and Rebecca Durst is the number of people who kind of came forward in defending the choice of those two and citing, specific women in West Virginia history, like Belle Boyd and Anne Bailey and, other women of the frontier who really were, part of statehood, right? Making this place a state. And the number of people who also came forward and said, hey, in case you hadn't noticed, none of us would be here if there weren't also women mountaineers, right? And I think that's really interesting too, that people are able to that people have been able to make that claim both historically and in the present, right? That 50% of the people who make up the state of West Virginia are mountaineer women, right? And you can't leave us out of that history, so why can't we be in the buckskins? And I'll say this freely, I stole a lot of my ideas, or at least the framework, to hang them on from a book by Anthony Harkins called Hillbilly, which is a broader kind of history about the hillbilly figure more generally. But a lot of the ideas that I had about these sort of twin roots of the Mountaineers, kind of evolution, came from his ideas about the hillbilly. So I would definitely recommend that. There's also a documentary called Hillbilly that's really created by PBS that's really useful. So I think there are definitely other things that people can look at that may not talk about the Mountaineers specifically, but kind of put these ideas in a bigger kind of regional and national context.